welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, I hope this isn't a surprise. You're up this week.
Oh, no.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing a post from Kelly Hayes' newsletter, Organizing My Thoughts. It was just a joke that I wasn't prepared.
Yeah.
The post that I'm bringing is called Trump's Latest Anti-Trans Actions and How We Can Fight Back. It breaks down most, if not all, of the anti-trans actions that this administration has taken. It's hard to keep track of them all.
Seriously.
And this was also written, I think it's a couple weeks old now
Yes.
at this point. But so who knows if this is all up to date. I don't think it is actually now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
But it features a lot of great stuff. There are some comments from Andrea Ritchie and from Dean Spade. There's a ton of great links to articles and resources. But I want to get started with highlighting some of the things that Kelly lays out here that the administration has done so far. So she says, quote, with executive orders aiming to ban gender-affirming care for people 18 years or younger and threatening to withhold federal funding from schools that teach gender ideology, these actions follow an executive order banning trans people from the U.S. military and an order declaring that a person's gender is chromosomally defined at conception. The claim that sex differentiation, which does not determine gender, occurs at conception is not only scientifically incorrect, but also signals a potential strategy to enshrine the anti-choice concept of fetal personhood in federal law. The administration also enacted a bathroom ban targeting trans people at all federal facilities this week. And then there is also a transgender woman who's suing the administration after she was moved to solitary confinement in preparation of being moved to a men's prison.
Yeah.
And some trans people have been unable to renew their passports. And there have been more reports about that have been ongoing. This is also happening in the backdrop of a trans person was kidnapped in upstate New York somewhere and held and tortured for weeks.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, just depraved things. And so these kinds of attacks are happening. And then there's the administrative violence of what the Trump administration is also trying to do. And so there's just so much happening. There's a lot of stuff that the administration has been doing to attack and denigrate and marginalize trans people. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this to the table to talk about today, is because I think that it's important to pay attention to how groups get marginalized, as it is one of the clear steps toward a fascist regime.
Right.
And it's happening. There's clear ways here that I think that's happening. And so I think it's important to talk about and keep front of mind. And so, yeah, that's why we're talking about this today. That's why I brought it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I feel like I've just been shaking my head the whole time you've been talking. And just, it's so sickening and sad what's been happening these past few weeks. It's really only been weeks. And it's just been too much, honestly. Mm-hmm. There's too much that the administration is doing to attack trans people and sort of, as you say, like deny their humanity and strip them of their rights and their dignity. And really to read this blog post and click through some of the links, I mean, it just was so overwhelming, which, also made me sit and think about what it must be like to be a trans person in this country and to witness this and to be living through it and to have to deal with the dangerous ramifications of it. I mean, that story of someone getting kidnapped, I mean, I hadn't heard that. That's just awful. And so all of it is just, as I said, disgusting and vile, and it's, as you say, fascism. And that's one of the things that Kelly talks about in this piece, which I think is nailing it. She says, quote, to distract from this smash and grab agenda, Trump must follow the fascist tradition of centering scapegoats. His favorite targets at present are immigrants and trans people. By blaming marginalized people for the supposed degradation of society and harming those people, Trump creates a spectacle for his supporters to applaud. Even as the services they depend on are imperiled, many will embrace a narrative that they are being protected and defended. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was so spot on. The analysis there of what's going on here, right? The othering of trans people and immigrants too, as Kelly points out.
Yeah.
This degradation of their humanity is straight out of the fascist playbook, Fascism 101. And it's just so sickening on all levels to see it all play out in the ways in which, again, trans folks are othered and the ways in which, people are sort of bought into that, buy into that because, well, he's doing this and this is helping me in some way. It's not, know?
Yeah. And this is also why I revisited Racism and Fascism a couple weeks ago on my little solo episode and read that because in that Toni Morrison lays out the ways that fascism operates and attacks individual groups.
Yes.
And that is very apparent here. Yeah. One of my favorite lines, I guess, from this piece is about how Trump is just a grievance grifter.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
So Kelly says, quote, Trump rode waves of public discontent to the White House, but he has nothing material to offer people who are dissatisfied with the state of the world or with their own lives. In fact, he and the band of billionaire looters who have attached themselves to this administration are determined to gut life-giving and life-saving services in order to further enrich the ultra-wealthy. His whole shtick is complaining about things that other people also complain about to gain their trust, and then to get them to point fingers at some marginalized group of people like trans people, and then assign all blame to that group and further demonize and marginalize them. He's got nothing to offer regular people.
Right.
He can't fix inflation. If he could, he wouldn't. He can't change or really won't change our lives for the better, meaning all regular people.
Yeah.
He's got his others, the people that he labels others that he wants us to blame everything on, and he's handing over the keys to Elon Musk, who's going to scrap the whole thing for parts, even the pieces of government that were and are working for people.
Yes. Grievance grifter. That took me out. But yeah, it's so wild to, again, be living in this time and witnessing all of the ways in which Trump and his administration are centering the ultra wealthy and the ways in which we're witnessing the shift of our democracy to an aristocracy. And I think to your point, nothing the administration is doing is serving the will of the people. It's all just so dangerous. It's all fascism.
But it's the Gulf of America now.
It's the Gulf of America, and we're all the better for that? Yeah, okay.
It's changed my life.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that Kelly included some analysis from Andrea Ritchie in this piece, and I always am a fan of Andrea Ritchie, and so I wanted to share what she had to say about all this, particularly what we need to and should do in spite of this attack on trans people. So she says, quote, she being Andrea Ritchie, stressed the importance of refusing to comply with Trump's edicts around gender-affirming care. While filled with vile, criminalizing language designed to deny the existence of trans kids and trans people, isolate them and their families and communities, and deter healthcare providers and educators from continuing care, these executive orders carry no consequences for providers who adhere to their commitment to offering affirming, life-saving, and scientifically sound treatment to their trans patients beyond threats to federal funding, Ritchie said. While federal funding cuts could carry severe consequences for collective capacity to offer care, they do not criminalize it. And I love that. I love the call to action and honestly sort of the call to consciousness by Andrea here to folks in positions where they can offer and help trans people to continue to do so in spite of these attacks. And I think that extends to all of us in really all of our aspects of our lives. And Andrea goes on to talk about this a little bit too. And so I think that was a really big takeaway for me. Like, what are the ways in which we need to continue to take care of us and all folks? What are the ways we stand up against this nonsense and fight against this nonsense in every way possible and everywhere? And what are the ways in which, particularly for our friends who are in healthcare, what are the ways that those folks can continue and should continue to do that work, to do no harm?
Yeah, do no harm. And they link to some resources from Interrupting Criminalization.
Yes.
Which Andrea Ritchie co-founded with Miriam Kaba. And we've talked about Do No Harm here on the show before. So it's a great resource to look into if you want to advocate for yourself in the medical field And or if you're some kind of medical provider or working in that space.
Yes.
Lots of great tips and resources and ways to approach
Absolutely.
doing no harm and refusing to follow orders like this.
To comply with this BS.
Which will cause harm. So another resource that is linked is called We Must Fight in Solidarity for Trans Youth, which is a really, really excellent resource that gives some history of the movement against trans people, provides some context for the bills that were introduced and passed in states across the country by the time that this particular resource was published in 2022, and some analysis of who's behind all of this. There's a really great chart of people and the things that they've done and how much money is connected to all of those things. So lots of great things to check out in this. But one of the pieces I want to mention is the section that outlines what's at stake.
Okay.
So the resource says, quote, anti-trans legislation fuels anti-feminist, ableist, anti-black, xenophobic, white supremacist agendas. Laws that criminalize one marginalized population are inevitably deployed against other groups that are vulnerable to state violence. Additionally, criminalization is a strategy to disenfranchise entire swaths of the population. Coupled with large-scale voter suppression, such laws are designed to maintain white minority rule through criminalization, incarceration, deportation, expulsion, and elimination. And this is why we have to care about this. We have to care about this as people of conscience, as we are invited into by Kelly Hayes later on in her article. And we should also know that eventually we all become the target of a regime that marginalizes people in this way.
Yes.
We all end up in the crosshairs some way, somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that piece of that quote around this criminalization being a strategy to disenfranchise entire swaths of this population. And you're absolutely right. If they're successful with this, then they are enabled to become successful in other ways and with other folks who they consider to be other or less than or whatever it may be. And so that sounded like a really incredible resource that I want to check out. And as you mentioned, Kelly also links to the Beyond Do No Harm Network, which we talked a little bit about, I think back in 2023. She also referenced Interrupting Criminalization's Healthcare Strategy Consult Desk, which also seems to be a great resource, again, for healthcare providers. So I'm glad that Kelly highlighted all of these great resources in this piece, and I hope folks check them out. In addition to these great resources and the insights from Andrea Ritchie, like I mentioned, and you said Dean Spade was mentioned too, Kelly also linked to some articles, including this really great piece in Slate about trans people not being allowed to renew their passport. And you sort of talked about this at the top. And I actually read the piece. It was great. I would encourage folks to read it. It's called Trump's Gender Orders Have a Lot of Horrifying Effects. This one might top the list. And what it does so brilliantly is that it just really highlights some of the lived experiences of trans people and their families, but particularly trans people from across the country trying to navigate life now and specifically navigate the impact of Trump's State Department's efforts to stop transgender, non-binary, intersex, and gender nonconforming Americans from getting passports, renewing passports that actually match their identity. And the piece was really powerful for so many reasons, but particularly because it highlighted the psychological damage that this is doing to trans people to have, your identity not match, what and who you are is so damaging and just so vile. And just the piece really, I think, brought to light just how unconscionable all of this is for folks. And again, it highlights both trans folks and their families. Like there's a mother in there who had twins and one of them is trans and she's doing everything she can to try to support both of her children. And it was beautiful to read about. And so, yeah, I appreciate Kelly for all of the things she highlighted in this great piece.
Yeah, and I've seen a few TikTok videos of people talking about how their application has been rejected, or they've got their passport back and they're labeled male. I just think about what that means when you go through a border and it seems like you're hiding something to that agent. Right. I just think about the ways that violence then escalates because your document doesn't match who you are visibly in front of me, and what that means for that agent and whatever.
Right.
And just the things that we know about what people with badges tend to do.
Yes.
Yeah. It's all all connected and tied in,
and so upsetting.
Probably the point.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about application. How do we apply this to our daily lives and work? My application comes from Dean Spade, who says, quote, "We can still do what we've always done, take care of each other, break rules, and help people get what they need to survive. All of us can help people get a place to sleep, get away from abusive parents and partners, find a meal or warm clothes. All of us can write to trans people who are locked up and form a support system from the outside. Many of us can share medicines or break rules at our jobs as nurses, teachers, social workers, doctors, to help people get essentials. This is a time for sustained care for one another, careful rule breaking, and disobedience in the face of illegitimate authority." So I love that.
I love it too. Wow.
It's really powerful, and it points out that there's been resistance forever, particularly for trans people and the community around trans people. There's always been resistance present. And I love the phrase at the end, illegitimate authority.
Yes.
I think that when we recognize that authority is illegitimate, it emboldens us to recognize that we don't have to follow through with this.
Absolutely.
I think about the ways that I made a flippant joke about the Gulf of America earlier, but that's like Elon changing Twitter to X.
Right.
Nobody calls it X.
Yeah.
Well, some people do, but that's his little fan club.
Yes.
The rest of us still call it Twitter, and the same will go for the Gulf of Mexico. We recognize the illegitimacy of these things that are more superficial, like changing the name changing the name of the Gulf. But we can also recognize and know it's illegitimate to make this form of care illegal.
Absolutely.
Or to claim that trans people can have passports that match who they are. All those things we know, that's illegitimate authority.
Yes.
Because it comes from a place of nonsense. It comes from a place of fascism. It comes from a place that's disconnected from the reality. And when we know that, when we recognize that, we can continue to stand up to it, resist it, and love one another in ways to create space for people to continue to be who they are.
Yes, and take care of one another, as Dean says there so brilliantly. I love that. I think that's spot on application and a great takeaway from this piece. Kelly actually builds on that great call to action from Dean with her own call to action at the end of the post. So I wanted to share how she closed this blog post. She says, quote, "The message should be clear among all people of conscience. We will not cooperate with the fascist anti-trans agenda. We will protect trans children. We will not live inside a fascist fantasy or impose it upon others. We will defy, resist, and refuse. We will defend each other." And yeah, I could not agree more. Like, we must make it loud and clear to this administration that the humanity of trans people is not something that's up for debate or deserves to be on an agenda in this way, period, full stop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
I think her closing the piece that way is just brilliant.
I loved it.
All right, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
It's homework time. What are we going to do to continue our learning beyond our conversation today? I want to go back to that resource that I mentioned earlier, We Must Fight in Solidarity for Trans Youth.
Okay.
And read through more of it because I read some of it because I pulled a quote from it, so I must have read something.
Yes.
But it seems like a publication that will clarify a lot of what we've been facing and what trans people have been facing and what we're going to continue to be facing with the Trump administration, who seems set on targeting trans people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I would love to check out that resource. I didn't get a chance to click in it at all, so I would love to do that. So I'll co-sign that homework. I would also love to read more of Kelly's blog posts in this newsletter of hers. I'm ashamed to admit that I have only read a couple of her blog posts, this being one of them. So, and I just think, given how incredibly brilliant I think she is and how much we've talked about her and referenced her and her work on our little podcast here, I'd love to just read more directly from her. So I've bookmarked this great newsletter of hers, and I'm excited to read more about it, read more from it, I should say.
Yeah, and it's free to subscribe.
Yes.
And there's also an option to support monthly if that's something that you can do. She also has a podcast called Movement Memos, which is published by Truth Out.
Yes.
So check that out too. Kelly Hayes does a lot of great work. She co-wrote a book that we read here on the podcast too. Co-wrote that with Miriam Kaba, Let This Radicalize You.
Yes, great book.
Yeah, so also read that. So check those things out too, folks. We'll do our homework and let's all do homework together.
Absolutely.
That's really the point of this whole interdependent study thing. All right, I'm done ranting. All right, Damien, you're up next time. What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought Dean Spade's words. This makes me connected. Our friends over at In These Times sent an email earlier today highlighting their latest articles, and I literally opened that email when I got home from hanging out with some friends, and they were talking about how they've been feeling a little overwhelmed by politics at the moment. And why? Yeah. And we were at brunch and we were like, let's have a good time instead. But it felt very timely to then open up In These Times email and see this piece. And I know we just had them here, but it felt timely and perfect. So the piece is called In the Face of Overwhelm. And it was written by Asha Ransby-Sporn, who is an organizer and writer and co-founder of the Black Youth Project 100 organization. And the byline of this piece reads, quote, "We owe it to each other to resist attempts to disorient, divide, and distract us from the reality of government takeover by the billionaire right." Mm-hmm. So, I'm excited to read this. I really hope that it offers, I did not read any of it, so I'm hoping that it offers us some tangible ways to not just resist what's happening, but to also deal with those feelings of being overwhelmed that I know most of us are experiencing these days. But again, I hope it also offers us some tangible action steps that we can take for where to go from here. So yeah, I'm excited to check this one out.
Yeah, me too. It sounds great. I just clicked on it and it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty lengthy, so I'm assuming it's going to be good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that and learning more about it. So we're going to read In the Face of Overwhelm and talk about that here next week. But for now, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.